uh, uh, allow me to tailor some of the comments that I'm going to make. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about wheat in general. Of course, over the long term, in Western Canada, on the Prairie provinces, we produce about 34 million tons of wheat per year, and Alberta produces about 11 million tons, or about 34% of that. So that's where Alberta fits in terms of wheat production. Most of the wheat that's produced in Western Canada is spring wheat. Only about 2 to 5% is actually winter wheat. So what you're looking at here is actually the largest winter wheat breeding program in Western Canada, and the only breeding program that's actively registering varieties in the red winter class, which is our milling and baking type. From the standpoint of spring wheat, about 60 to 65% of the acreage is our premium quality Canada Western Red Spring type of wheat that's world renowned for its milling and baking quality. The second most popular class, which is grown primarily in Saskatchewan, but it also is becoming more and more popular in Alberta, particularly in the south, is, I'll see if I can, that's not helping. No. Yeah, just like this? You think this is better? Oh, okay, good. So the second most popular is our Durham class. And like I said, it's 20 to 22% of the acres, primarily in Saskatchewan, but also in southern Alberta. So when you add that up, between 80 and about 87% of the wheat that's grown in Western Canada is those two classes. And we've actually got 9 different market classes on the books here in Western Canada. And so the rest of the classes are known as minor classes, and indeed they are. From the standpoint of ranking for acreage, one of our classes called Canada Prairie Spring Red, which is a medium protein type of product and competes well in world markets against US hard red winters and so on, is on about 5% of the acres. That acreage tends to be concentrated in Alberta, more central Alberta than anywhere else. And then, of course, the other medium protein type of wheat that's grown is the red winter, which I concentrate on. And it tends to vary between 2 and 5% of the acres across Western Canada. Right now, we're on that lower end, being 2%, largely because producers over the past 2 or 3 years have had some real difficulty getting the crop in the ground, either due to late wet falls or very dry falls, and the fear that the soils were just too dry to get germination. So, but we're hoping acreage comes back up, and the highest acreage we've had in across Western Canada is 1.5 million acres. And so Brian Barris and I have looked at things and looked at weather patterns and where winter wheat could be produced, and there's really no reason why we couldn't be producing 3 and even 4 million acres of winter wheat if people adjusted their rotations and had the proper planning to put it in. Of course, it has to be economic, and that at the very beginning of that is where I come in terms of plant breeding. And what you see in front of you here is one of my main breeding sites, which is a lot of the early generation material, as well as this block in front of you here that's kind of separated from everything else, which is our seed increase plots. And those seed increase plots are our most advanced lines, as well as cultivars that we rogue to uniformity, and that forms the basis for the seed that we use this fall in our trials. From an early generation standpoint, out here we've got about 23,000 rows. All of those rows are potential varieties that I will select, make selections on, and they could be in yield trials within the next couple of years. So what do I look for? Of course, on the agronomic side, cold tolerance and winter survival is an overarching goal. If we can't get the crop through the winter, we don't have a crop. So that's number one. Number two, of course, on agronomics is yield. We want high yield. Because I'm breeding varieties for across Western Canada, of course, varieties that fit well here may not fit well in the Red River Valley of Manitoba, or may not fit well in Beaver Lodge. And just for those of you who aren't from here, Beaver Lodge is about 1,000 kilometers, or yeah, about that, north of here. And so very much longer days and shorter season during the summer, and bitterly cold winters, generally with a lot of snow. Winter wheat is actually becoming more popular up there. We can get it through with the agronomic systems that have been developed over the past couple or 3 decades. The Red River Valley in Manitoba is very much a floodplain, dark black clay soils, very rich, high fertility, high moisture. Tends to be an area where you see a lot of fusarium head blight, and very much different than here. So it's very difficult to develop one variety that fits all applications. But what we're doing is we're using an approach that tries to, that attempts to get good general adaptation across all of those environments. And the way we do that is that we shift our selection environment 3 or 4 times in the early generations. So F2 and 3 are actually here in Lethbridge, and we will grow them under irrigation so we get maximum expression of height as well as disease resistance, or disease expression. If there's disease, we get rid of those plants. If they're too tall, we get rid of them. If it's a poor plant type as well. So we only select the best, and F3 is kind of a continuation of that. From there, in the F4, we take things to Saskatoon. Saskatoon being a much harsher winter than what we have here. And the idea is that we skew the populations towards better winter hardiness. And so I do my selections there. We thresh all the heads individually, and each one of those heads becomes a row in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, inoculated with leaf and stem rust, and I only select out of those rows that have resistance. And so by that time, we've already selected for stripe rust resistance, for cold hardiness, for leaf rust, and for stem rust resistance. Those heads will come back here. If there's potential for bunt resistance, we'll actually put those rows in a bunt nursery, and I'll select out of there as well. If not, and of course bunt is easily treated by fungicides, by seed treatments, so it's less of a priority for my program, but certainly still is being looked at. What we do is they go back into rows here. We select, again, for excellent plant type and survivability, for stripe rust resistance, tan spot resistance, and so on. And out of the 23,000 rows that we have this year, about half of which are double haploids, we select about 2,300 rows. So we get rid of about 90%. Those lines then get put into what I call a preliminary trial. It's the first time we look at yield. It's a 1-rep trial with repeated checks, and that's the only time that the lines are actually evaluated for yield under irrigation. Now, why would we do this under irrigation when most of the crop is grown on dry land? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, we want to see maximum yield expression in an environment where we can load up on disease. So the easiest way to understand that is it's a whole lot easier to see a 10% yield difference at 100 bushels per acre than it is at 20. And so we look for those high yielding lines. We tend to get a lot more height out of the lines, and if the line's going to lodge, it will. We tend to seed at a little bit higher than recommended seeding rates, somewhere between that 450 to 500 seeds per square meter. We use high fertility and lots of water. And so if a line lodges, that's it. I won't see it again. It won't go forward. And so 20 years ago when I started breeding winter wheat, having bred spring wheat prior to that, I was told, you know, you're moving to Lethbridge, you're going to have a heck of a time breeding anything that has decent straw strength. And what that person forgot was that I had irrigation. And I've actually been able to develop some of the strongest straw material out there. And you can see in this area here, those are the advanced lines, and there's absolutely nothing lodging. If you look in that corner over there, you'll see about 6 or 7 plots that are tall. Those are very old historical varieties that are out there just as a demonstration. They're really not grown anymore, and they will lodge. But it's kind of fun to put them out there just to see where we've been. Okay, so once we hit preliminary trials, we also start putting all the lines through a fusarium nursery, either in Carman, Manitoba, or in Ottawa, in Ontario, that's inoculated for fusarium head blight, so we can select against that. Now, I did mention doubled haploids. That generally shaves about 3 years off the breeding process for winter wheat, recognizing that we can only grow 1 generation per year because of the vernalization requirement. Because the doubled haploids, once they hit rows in the field, have never been in the field before and not selected under field conditions with disease. We may have used molecular markers to skew the populations towards resistance, but they've never been screened in the field. What we do is we harvest the rows and then put most of the seed aside for a year while we take small amounts and put them in all the different disease nurseries that we can. And by doing that, we're able to get rid of about 70% of the ones we selected. And once we've done that, they then go to the preliminary yield trials. This allows us to be a lot more effective in terms of what gets tested. So I target about 1,400 new genotypes every year for preliminary trials. And in this area here, we have about 1,200. And out of that 1,400 in total, I whittle that down prior to planting this fall to about 120. So again, we get rid of about 90%. And we actually put those 120 or possibly a few more kind of second tier lines that didn't get advanced through quality testing. Now that's one of the challenges of winter wheat breeding here in Western Canada is, of course, we're not finished our harvest until around the end of August, and we need to have everything turned around and planted by the end of September. So we definitely don't have time to do a lot of quality testing. We do protein concentration, and that's about it. And over the winter, we do extensive quality testing, and we find out which ones we shouldn't have planted. But that's just the way it is. Fortunately, there are, I would say, out of the preliminary lines, in general, it's about half to 60% that look to have pretty good quality. But I'm also making crosses with very elite material that has good quality. If you start messing around with poor quality by good quality, you tend to end up with poor quality. So From preliminary trials, that 120 lines goes into replicated trials at 5 sites across Western Canada, everywhere from here right through to Brandon, Manitoba. And those 120 lines get whittled down to about 30 to 35 lines. And those are grown at 9 sites across the prairies. And out of that 35, I'll pick 5, 6, sometimes 7 lines that will go to registration trials. And over the 3 years that they're in registration trials, of course, they're tested for agronomics, disease and quality, and anything that fails gets booted out. I feel pretty fortunate that since 2008, we've been able to put out a new variety every year with the exception of 2 years. So, you know, for the size of program and so on, I think that's actually pretty good. One of the reasons for that, and it's more for the education of our Australian visitors, is up until 2008, we had something called kernel visual distinguishability. So I was mentioning that we've got 9 different market classes of wheat in Western Canada. I think at the time we had only 7, but each of those 7 had a unique combination of size, color, and shape. And so as a breeder, I could develop the best winter wheat that you ever saw. If it had the wrong kernel type or was a mixture of kernel types, I would not be able to register it. And a good example of that is that the 4 breeding programs that were operational at the time, none of us were able to develop or register a variety between 2001 and 2008 when KVD was finally abolished. Since that time, we've had far more varieties that have been developed. So that's been a real boon to the program and to wheat breeding in general. I think I'll leave it at that. Are there any questions?
What type of typical yield benefit do you see for winter?
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, on average here in Alberta, the average yield for spring wheat is, I think, 3.4 tons per hectare, which is just a shade over 50 bushels to the acre. For winter wheat, recognizing it is a smaller sample size, it's actually 15% higher. Now, you go over into Manitoba, more fertile soils, tends to have more rainfall and so on. The yield of spring wheat is actually a little bit lower. It's around 45 bushels to the acre, so just over the 3 tons. But winter wheat is actually 38 to 40% higher yielding. And a large part of that is because winter wheat is able to use that early spring moisture that farmers are waiting to dry off prior to seeding. Now, there is a downside to that, of course, and we saw it this year. Early spring drought is the Achilles heel of any winter cereal. And so if you have a severe drought early on in the season, the winter cereals are really going to suffer. No, I'm not. So I guess you need to get going?
We should wrap up.
Okay, very good. I'll take one last question. Yep. Oh gosh. I wouldn't want to give a time frame, but I would say, considering that, at least in my mind, there is no doubt that our climate is changing. We are getting less severe winters. February was pretty brutal here, but prior to that, you would have had no argument from anybody. I think winter wheat will become more of an option on the prairies as time goes on. And certainly from, I know from a federal government standpoint, from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's standpoint, breeding winter cereals, breeding winter wheat is one of those things they feel is very important because it could form part of a climate change strategy. So yes, I think it will increase. What the acreage will be and when that'll happen, I don't know.
Average harvest day of irrigated
Oh boy. Okay. These plots would be later than what you'd normally see under irrigation because we actually seed later. We seed at later than recommended just because we don't have the time to get everything done. But most years, it would certainly be wrapped up by the end of August or even earlier. Mid-August wouldn't be out of the question. It would depend somewhat on water management as well.
Alrighty.
Okay.